The year is 1718. You are standing on the deck of HMS Pearl, a Royal Navy warship with 42 guns, 3 masts, and a crew of 160 men. She is one of the most powerful vessels the British Empire has ever put to sea. She is sinking. Not from a storm, not from enemy cannon fire. The hull is taking water through seams that have been rotting for 2 years. The carpenter has been reporting the problem for 6 months. Nobody listened. The pumps have been running for 4 hours straight and the water is still rising. 3 men have already drowned in the lower decks. The rest are bailing with buckets. Meanwhile, 500 meters away, a pirate sloop called the Ranger is watching. She carries 8 guns. Her crew is 37 men. On paper, she should not even be a threat to HMS Pearl. She is smaller, lighter, less armed, and commanded by a man who was a carpenter's assistant 18 months ago. The Ranger is not sinking. The Ranger has never sunk. In the golden age of piracy, between 1680 and 1730, the British Royal Navy lost hundreds of warships to rot, disease, mechanical failure, and navigational error. The pirates who terrorized those same waters lost almost none of their ships to those causes. That asymmetry has never been properly explained, not in the history books, not in the documentaries, not in the films, because the answer is not about ship design. It is not about luck. It is not even about courage. The answer is about something the British Empire could not afford to admit existed. Because if they admitted it, they would have had to admit that the pirates had built a better system than the Royal Navy. And that is a sentence that changes everything you think you know about why the age of piracy ended the way it did. By the time this video ends, you are going to understand something that most historians treat as a footnote, but is actually the central fact of the entire era. Pirate ships survived because the people who sailed them had a direct economic interest in keeping them alive. Royal Navy warships sank because the people who commanded them had no such interest, and in fact had incentives that pointed in the opposite direction. That sounds abstract. It will not stay abstract for long. You are going to meet the specific men who built the pirate maintenance system, a system so effective that Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, a ship he had captured and extensively modified, was still fully operational after 2 years of continuous Atlantic warfare. You are going to understand exactly why a 60-gun Royal Navy flagship could develop a hull leak that killed 30 men while anchored in a protected harbor. And you are going to find out what happened when the British government finally figured out what the pirates had done and chose to bury the evidence rather than reform the Navy. There is one document in this story that the Admiralty classified for 40 years. When it was finally released, it contained an internal assessment that a senior naval officer had written in 1721. The assessment concluded that the average pirate vessel was maintained to a standard 3 times higher than the average Royal Navy warship of equivalent size. 3 times. Stay until the end. Because the last 10 minutes of this story are not about pirates. They are about what happens when a system that is supposed to protect people starts protecting itself instead. That story is not 300 years old. To understand what comes next, you need to understand what a Royal Navy warship actually was in 1700, not what it looked like. what it was. It was a government-owned asset managed by a bureaucracy called the Navy Board, crewed by men who had no say in their assignment, maintained by contractors who were paid per job rather than per result, and commanded by officers whose promotions depended on political connections more than operational competence. A first-rate warship of 100 guns cost the Crown approximately £40,000 to build, roughly equivalent to £60 million today. The problem was that once she was built, nobody with real power had a personal financial stake in keeping her operational. The officers were paid whether the ship sailed or rotted at anchor. The contractors were paid per repair, meaning more rot meant more income. The Navy Board approved budgets in London based on reports written by the same men who had written the previous reports. Nobody went down to look at the hull. Now understand what a pirate ship was. It was a stolen or purchased vessel owned, in most cases, collectively by her crew. Under the pirate articles that governed virtually every major pirate operation of the era, the ship was a shared asset. If she sank, everyone lost their home, their weapons, their food, and their one mechanism of survival. There was no government to replace her. There was no insurance. There was no shore posting to fall back on. The ship was everything. That difference, that single structural difference in who bore the consequences of failure, is what this entire story is about. In 1695, a man named Henry Every pulled off what was then the largest maritime robbery in recorded history. His crew attacked the Ganges Sawai, a Mughal treasure ship carrying over 600,000 pounds in gold, silver, and jewels, the equivalent of roughly 1 billion pounds today. The raid took less than 2 hours. Every ship was called the Fancy. She was a former Royal Navy vessel, a slave ship before that. Every had captured her, modified her, and sailed her across 3 oceans in 14 months without losing a single man to mechanical failure. When the British government launched the pursuit, 6 Royal Navy warships, the largest pirate hunting fleet the Crown had ever assembled. 3 of those warships experienced significant mechanical failures within the first 4 months of the chase. One lost her mainmast in weather that experienced Caribbean sailors described as moderate. Another developed a leak so severe she had to be careened, laid on her side to expose the hull, for 3 weeks during what was supposed to be an active pursuit. Every escaped. Not because he was faster, not because he was luckier. He escaped because his ship worked. The Fancy worked because Every's crew maintained her with the intensity of men who knew their lives depended on it, which they did, in the most literal possible sense. Every article in the pirate code that governed the Fancy contained provisions about ship maintenance. The crew voted on careening schedules. Every man was assigned maintenance duties in rotation. The ship's carpenter was one of the 3 highest-paid positions on board, receiving a share and a half of all prize money. In the Royal Navy, the carpenter was a warrant officer, paid a fixed wage of roughly £2 per month regardless of outcome. £2 per month, whether the ship sailed or sank. That is not an incentive to fix the ship. That is an incentive to submit maintenance reports to people who cannot verify them. But there was a problem with every success that nobody in the pirate world fully understood at the time. The Ganges Sawai was a Mughal ship. Its passengers included the relatives of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. What happened to them during the raid was described in contemporary accounts as systematic and deliberate. The details are not in dispute. What is in dispute is what the British government decided to do about it, because the East India Company, the private corporation that controlled Britain's trade with India, had exclusive trading rights that depended entirely on the Mughal emperor's goodwill. Every had just personally destroyed that goodwill. The emperor closed British trading ports. He imprisoned East India Company representatives. He threatened to expel British merchants from India entirely. The company calculated its losses at over £600,000 per year if the situation was not resolved. The British government had a choice. They could treat every as a criminal who had embarrassed the empire and move on. Or they could make every an example so extreme, so public, so undeniable, that the Mughal emperor would have to accept it as genuine contrition. They chose the example. And the pursuit that followed, the one with the 3 broken warships, was not primarily about catching every. It was about being seen to try. That distinction matters, because it means the Navy Board sent ships they knew were in questionable condition into a chase they expected to fail, because the political value of the appearance of pursuit was worth more than the operational value of an actual capture. HMS Sheerness, one of the pursuit vessels, had submitted maintenance requests for hull caulking 17 months before the chase began. Those requests had been approved in principle and then not funded for 3 consecutive budget cycles. When she limped back to Port Royal in Jamaica in late 1696 with a compromised hull and a crew that had lost 4 men to disease, the official report described the mission as a qualified success. 4 men dead. 1 pirate escaped with £1 billion. Qualified success. What happened with every was not an anomaly. It was the pattern. In 1701, Captain William Kidd, a man the British government had specifically commissioned to hunt pirates, was hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping. His body was left in a gibbet over the Thames for 3 years as a warning to other pirates. The official story was simple. Kidd had gone rogue. He had turned pirate himself. He was a traitor and a murderer, and he died as he deserved. The official story was missing several facts. Fact 1. Kidd's commission had been funded by a private syndicate that included 4 senior British lords and the First Lord of the Admiralty. They had provided him with a vessel, the Adventure Galley, that was already 12 years old at the time of commissioning and had not been properly surveyed before she sailed. Fact 2. The Adventure Galley began leaking within 3 months of departure. Kidd's logs, which still exist in the National Archives in London, describe a ship that was functionally compromised from the beginning of the voyage. By 1698, she was taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. The crew was bailing by hand around the clock. Fact 3. Kidd's decision to attack the Quedagh merchant. The act that was classified as piracy occurred at the moment when he faced a choice between returning to London in a ship that might not survive the voyage or transferring to a vessel that could actually float. He transferred. That decision cost him his life. But read that sequence again before you accept the official version of what William Kidd was. A government contractor sent to sea in a broken ship, funded by lords who needed political cover, forced by mechanical failure into a decision that was then classified as criminal, and hanged publicly, while his backers quietly withdrew from the record. His backers, incidentally, kept the proceeds from his legitimate captures. The ships and cargo he had legally taken before the Quetta merchant incident, they kept those. Kidd was hanged. They kept the money. This is where the story becomes something different than a pirate story, because the same year Kidd was hanged, a man named Benjamin Hornigold was operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas. Hornigold would go on to mentor Blackbeard, Charles Vane, and, most consequentially, Samuel Bellamy, who became the richest pirate in recorded history before the age of 29. Hornigold's flagship was a sloop called the Benjamin. She was approximately 10 years old when Hornigold acquired her. She sailed for another 7 years without a single significant mechanical failure. 7 years of continuous Atlantic operations. Hurricanes, pursuit, repeated combat, tropical rot, the works. 7 years. The Benjamin's maintenance records, pieced together from captured pirate documents, colonial port records, and the accounts of prisoners, reveal a ship that was careened every 6 to 8 weeks without exception. That schedule was not set by Hornigold. It was set by a crew vote. The articles that governed Hornigold's operations specified the minimum maintenance intervals as clearly as they specified prize shares. Article 9 of a typical pirate code from this period read, "The sloop shall be careened no less than once every 2 months, and any man who conceals damage to the hull or rigging shall forfeit his share for that voyage." Forfeiture of share. For concealing damage. In the Royal Navy, the equivalent regulation read, "The carpenter shall report the condition of the hull to the first lieutenant at intervals no less than quarterly. Report to the first lieutenant, who reports to the captain, who reports to the Navy Board, who approves funding, in London, where nobody has ever seen the hull." The structural gap between those two systems is not a detail. It is the entire story. The numbers tell a story that the official histories prefer to keep quiet. Between 1689 and 1720, the Royal Navy lost approximately 223 ships to non-combat causes: storm damage, structural failure, disease-related crew collapse, and what the official logs euphemistically called navigational incident. Of those 223 ships, a substantial proportion had active maintenance requests outstanding at the time of loss. Requests that had been filed, approved in principle, unfunded. In the same period, researchers tracing pirate vessel records through colonial port documents, captured crew depositions, and Admiralty intelligence reports have identified approximately 430 distinct pirate vessels operating in Atlantic waters. Of those, fewer than 40 were lost to non-combat mechanical failure. Fewer than 40 out of 430. That is not a statistical anomaly. That is a controlled experiment. And one of the men running that experiment, without calling it that, without knowing that historians would eventually try to reconstruct what he had built, was a quiet, methodical Bahamian pirate named Samuel Bellamy. Bellamy arrived in Nassau in 1715 with nothing: no ship, no crew, no capital. He was 26 years old, formerly a Royal Navy sailor, and he had spent 2 years working as a salvage diver on Spanish wrecks off the Florida coast for a salary that amounted to 7 shillings per week. He had watched the men who owned the salvage operation collect the treasure he pulled from the seabed and understood with perfect clarity the economics of being the person who did the dangerous work for the people who owned the equipment. He decided to own the equipment. The ship he eventually acquired, through a combination of capture and crew vote that was standard pirate procedure, was a former slave ship called the Whydah Galley. She was a 3-masted galley, 102 feet long, carrying 28 guns when Bellamy took her. He added another 10 guns. He modified the rigging for speed, and then, before doing anything else, he careened her completely. 4 weeks on a protected Bahamian beach, hull exposed, every seam recaulked, every plank that showed rot replaced. 4 weeks. Before a single raid, before any revenue. The crew voted for it unanimously. They voted for it because they had all come from ships where that decision was made by people who were not going to be on board when the seams failed. They knew what a leaking hull felt like at 3 in the morning when the pumps were going and the water was still rising. They had all been on those ships. Most of them had left those ships or been thrown off them before ending up in Nassau. They voted for the 4 weeks because they understood, in the wordless way that men understand things they have survived, that the alternative was death. That was the pirate advantage. Not ruthlessness, not lawlessness, not the absence of rules. It was skin in the game. But there was something happening in Nassau in 1715 that was about to make all of this irrelevant. Something that would force the British government to confront, for the first time, exactly what the pirates had built, and how much it was costing the empire to pretend it didn't exist. The Spanish treasure fleet of 1715 had sunk in a hurricane off the coast of Florida. 11 ships, 14 million pieces of eight. The greatest concentration of sunken wealth in the Atlantic. Every pirate in the Caribbean knew exactly where it was, and the British government was about to discover that the pirates had a better intelligence network, better ships, and better crew discipline than the Royal Navy force sent to stop them from getting there first. In 1716, Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia received an intelligence report that should have been impossible. The report detailed the location, heading, crew composition, and armament of 11 pirate vessels operating in the Bahamas and the Carolinas. It identified their captains by name. It described their operational patterns. It estimated their combined firepower. It had been compiled by a former Royal Navy officer named Woodes Rogers, who had spent 8 months interviewing sailors, merchants, and captured pirates in Caribbean ports. The report contained a section that Spotswood underlined in his personal copy and sent to the Board of Trade in London with a note that read, "This section warrants particular attention and may cause some discomfort." The section was titled, "On the Superior Maintenance and Readiness of Piratical Vessels Compared to His Majesty's Ships of the Same Rate." Woodes Rogers, a man who was not a pirate sympathizer, a man who would later be appointed governor of the Bahamas, specifically to destroy the pirate republic that had formed there, had concluded after 8 months of direct observation that the average pirate sloop was better maintained, better supplied, and better crewed than the Royal Navy frigates tasked with hunting her. He identified the specific reason. The pirates had solved the principal agent problem that had been destroying the Royal Navy for a generation. In economic terms, the pirates had aligned the interests of every man on the ship with the operational condition of the ship. Every crew member was simultaneously an owner, an operator, and a beneficiary. There was no separation between the people who bore the risk and the people who made the decisions. In the Royal Navy, the separation was total. The officers owned nothing. The crew owned nothing. The contractors profited from failure. The bureaucrats in London were insulated from consequences by 4 layers of reporting structure. Nobody in the chain of command had a personal financial stake in whether the ship actually worked. Rogers called this the pirate advantage, and he used that phrase specifically in writing, in an official document submitted to the British government. The document was classified. Not suppressed entirely, it remained in the Board of Trade Archives, catalogued but not publicly available. It was not declassified until 1763, 40 years after Rogers submitted it, and by that time the age of piracy was already a legend rather than a recent memory. Here is what that classification meant in practice. In 1717, 1 year after Rogers submitted his report, the Navy Board approved funding for 11 new frigates to combat piracy in the Atlantic. The design specifications for those frigates were essentially unchanged from the specifications used in the 1690s. The maintenance contracts were awarded to the same contractors who had been supplying defective caulking and substandard timber for 20 years. The crew incentive structure was unchanged. The government had received a detailed analysis explaining precisely why its ships were inferior to pirate vessels. They had the document in their possession. They chose to build more of the same ships anyway. Now go back to William Kidd. Go back to the leaking adventure galley, the political backers, the classified report. Go back to the 3 warships that failed during the pursuit of Henry Every. None of those failures were accidents. They were the predictable outputs of a system that had been designed, consciously or not, to prioritize appearance over function, political cover over operational competence, and the financial interests of contractors and officers over the survival of the men who actually sailed the ships. The pirates had accidentally built something the British Empire could not acknowledge without dismantling part of itself, a merit system. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July of 1718 with a royal proclamation, a small naval escort, and a mandate to end the pirate republic that had made New Providence Island the most lawless harbor in the Atlantic. He succeeded. By 1720, the major pirate captains of the Golden Age were dead, captured, or in hiding. Blackbeard was killed at Ocracoke Inlet in November 1718. Stady Bonnet was hanged in Charleston. Charles Vane was hanged in Jamaica. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate captain in the history of the Atlantic, over 400 ships taken in 3 years, was killed by grape shot off the coast of West Africa in February 1722. The age of piracy was over. And here is what happened immediately afterward. The Royal Navy's maintenance crisis did not improve. It got worse. In 1739, Britain entered the War of Jenkins' Ear against Spain, the first major naval engagement of that conflict. The siege of Cartagena de Indias in 1741 ended in one of the most catastrophic British military defeats of the 18th century. Admiral Vernon commanded 186 ships and 29,000 soldiers. He lost over 18,000 men, the majority to disease and exposure compounded by ships that could not be properly ventilated, hulls that could not be adequately cleaned, and supply systems that delivered rotten food and contaminated water. The Spanish defenders numbered fewer than 3,600 men. They did not win the battle. The British Navy lost it to itself. An investigation afterward identified ship maintenance failures as a contributing factor in 23 of the 31 vessels that were assessed as operationally compromised during the siege. 23 ships failed maintenance in 1741. 20 years after Woodes Rogers had submitted his classified report explaining exactly why Royal Navy ships failed and pirate ships did not. The report was still classified. What happened to the pirates' maintenance innovations? They did not disappear. They were absorbed, slowly, reluctantly, over decades, into the merchant marine. The careening schedules, the crew accountability systems, the carpenter's share, the collective ownership model. Commercial shipping companies adopted elements of the pirate system because they worked, and because commercial shipping, unlike the Royal Navy, could not afford the luxury of blaming political enemies when a ship went down. By 1750, the most advanced maintenance practices in Atlantic shipping were being used by merchant vessels whose protocols traced directly back to the codes written by men who were now hanged skeletons in iron cages at the mouths of British harbors. The Empire killed the pirates. The pirates' ideas outlived the Empire. The specific mechanisms of transmission are traceable. In the 1720s and 1730s, a significant number of pardoned pirates, men who had accepted the Crown's amnesty offer and returned to legitimate sailing, went to work for merchant shipping companies. They brought their habits with them, the careening schedules, the crew accountability systems, the insistence on collective inspection before long voyages. Merchant captains who hired former pirates noted, sometimes in writing, always with ambivalence, that these men were unusually particular about the condition of the hull. Unusually particular. A merchant captain named Thomas Dummer, writing to a business partner in Bristol in 1728, described his recently hired former pirate boatswain as a man of excellent practical judgment regarding the ship's fabric, who will not suffer the carpenter to file a false report, and who organized the crew to assist in caulking without complaint or instruction. Dummer added, almost as an afterthought, "I do not ask where he learned these habits." He knew where he had learned them. He chose not to say. By 1750, the most advanced maintenance practices in Atlantic shipping were being used by merchant vessels, whose protocols traced directly back to the codes written by men who were now hanged skeletons in iron cages at the mouths of British harbors. Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam, the Robin Hood of pirates, killed when his ship the Whydah went down in a Massachusetts storm in April 1717, had given a speech to a captured captain that was recorded by that captain and preserved in a deposition filed in Boston. Bellamy said, "They vilify us. The scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." He was 28 years old. He died 12 days later, The Whydah, the captured slave ship Bellamy had converted to a pirate flagship, had been sailing for less than a year. Her loss was not mechanical failure. She was caught in a nor'easter, driven onto a sandbar, and broke apart in 40-foot seas. The storm killed 144 men. The ship was not the problem. The sea was. That distinction mattered to nobody who was trying to justify hanging them. What the official record of the golden age of piracy chose not to emphasize was this. In a 50-year period when the Royal Navy lost ships with a frequency that would be considered catastrophic by any modern operational standard, to rot, to neglect, to contractor fraud, to the systematic failures of a bureaucracy that valued paperwork over ships, the pirates lost almost none of their vessels to those causes. They lost ships to storms, to combat, to the occasional navigational error, not to the slow institutional rot that was eating the Royal Navy from the inside. The Admiralty knew this. Rogers had told them. They buried it. And the men who built the better system, who solved the problem Rogers spent 8 months documenting, never got credit for it. Not in their lifetimes, not in their deaths, not in the histories written by the people who killed them. Their ships, though, their ships sailed. There is a pattern in this story that has nothing to do with pirates. Every system that separates the people who bear consequences from the people who make decisions will eventually produce the results you saw in this story. It does not matter whether the system is a naval bureaucracy, a government agency, a corporation, or something you encountered last week. When the people at the top are insulated from the cost of their decisions, the decisions get worse, not immediately, not all at once, gradually. The rot is slow. The reports still get filed. The meetings still happen. The language of competence continues to circulate long after the competence has left the building. The pirates understood this, not because they were philosophers, because they were poor men on dangerous ships who had learned that the difference between surviving and drowning was whether the person responsible for fixing the hull had a personal reason to actually fix it. That is not a revolutionary insight. It is a primitive one. It is the kind of thing you understand when the water is rising around your ankles and you know that nobody in London is going to feel it. What made the Royal Navy's failure remarkable was not that it happened. Systems fail. What made it remarkable was that the solution was documented, submitted in writing, classified, and then ignored for 40 years while men continued to die in ships that should not have been at sea. Woodes Rogers, the man who classified that report, the man who ended the pirate republic, the man who hanged more pirates than anyone in the Atlantic, died in Nassau in 1732, deeply in debt, his salary unpaid for 3 years by the same government that had sent him to do the impossible. The records show he submitted 17 requests for back pay in his final 4 years. None were approved before his death. Even the man who killed the pirates got the pirates' ending. There is a question that historians still argue about, and it does not have a clean answer. Were the pirates criminals who happened to build an efficient maintenance system? Or were they something stranger? Working-class men from the bottom of the British social order who built, in the one space where the crown could not reach them, a functional alternative to the system that had discarded them? The Royal Navy called them monsters. The Royal Navy's ships were rotting, The monster's ships were not. Think about what that means the next time someone in authority tells you that the official version of something is the only version. Think about what gets classified. Think about who benefits from the classification. And think about what it means that the most effective maintenance system in the 18th century Atlantic was written by men who were already dead when anyone in power admitted it had ever existed. If this story made you see something differently, subscribe, because there are more of these. Stories the official record filed away and hoped you would not find. Stories where the footnote is more important than the chapter. Stories where the monster turns out to be the most interesting part of the machinery. Somewhere off the Carolina coast, the sea is still moving over the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's ship, a vessel that was maintained against all institutional odds, against all the incentives of empire, against everything the Royal Navy had built, by men who understood that a ship is only as good as the people who have a reason to keep her alive. She still has not finished sinking.